Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Florida City and County Management Association's webinar entitled Long-Term Perspectives on Remote Work. My name is Bob Lee, and I have the pleasure of serving as your host today. Joining me as co-host is Dr. Dina Hurst and Mr. Mike Ryko. Both Dina and Mike are employed with the John Scott Daly Florida Institute of Government, and they'll be the people who will be providing the technology assistance today for both the panelists and myself. Sponsors for today's program, in addition, of course, to FCCMA, is the Florida League of Cities, the John Scott Daly Florida Institute of Government, the Center for Florida Local Government Excellence, and three corporate sponsors, Government Services Group, Strategic Government Resources, and Granicus. We appreciate very much their continued support of the FCCMA webinars. For those who may not have attended a GoToTraining webinar before, I want to refer you to your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Most notably, I would like you to take a look at the chat box tool. By clicking on the chat box, you'll be able to type in any question you may have for today's attendees. Simply type it in and hit the send button, and we'll receive it and do our very best to get an answer to your question. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our two panelists. Our first panelist is Unica Walcott, and Unica is the proposal manager for Moffitt and Nickel. Welcome, Unica.
Thank you.
Our second panelist is Elizabeth Keller. Elizabeth is the Director of Public Policy for the International City and County Management Association, and most people in the profession know her as Beth. So welcome, Beth.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Before we begin the questions, and this is going to be a very informal conversation, I do have a few questions that are prepared for today's panelists, but we want to encourage, again, the attendees to submit their questions so that we could have, again, that informal conversation that we're looking for. So before we begin, though, Beth, would you mind just summarizing your background for the attendees so they know a little bit about you?
Sure. I started my local government career with the city of Sunnyvale, California, and I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. I had studied political science and international affairs in graduate school, but local government's the best. And I've spent most of my career at ICMA in a variety of jobs, and also led the Center for State and Local Government Excellence for 10 years.
Oh, thank you, Beth. Unica.
Thank you. My name is Unica Walcott. I joined Moffitt and Nickel in 2018. Prior to that, my career kind of took me on a bit of a windy journey. I've worked in the retail, mortgage, and media industries. I like to say my superpower is helping people broker relationships through communication.
Thank you, Unica. One of the things we're going to do, Mike, Mike Ryko and I chatted ahead of time, and I'm going to have him just move the slides. We only have a few of them, but this will enable me to concentrate more on the chat and working with our panelists. So let's go ahead. We're looking at the first question here. And I'm going to pose this to Beth to start off, I think. The question is, how has the COVID pandemic changed the way government works, operates, and delivers services?
So I think in many respects, the pandemic has accelerated a lot of the trends that were already in place. We've talked about trying to automate everything, become more efficient using technology. And boy, did we ever get the chance to try out in a quick way what it would be like to have almost everybody in our organizations teleworking, setting up public meetings so that people could truly participate in a virtual way. And I think more virtual services. We saw, even prior to the pandemic, some places were moving to virtual building inspections as one example. And it just made it a necessity to try to figure out how we could provide more services essential services in a remote fashion. Not that it was easy or the ideal circumstances, but as they say, there's nothing like a crisis to focus the mind. We also discovered, I think, in a hard way, that our schools and some of the needs that we have with broadband were not sufficient to what was required for virtual learning. So one of the things I was very proud of was to see many cities and counties setting up hotspots, finding ways to help give access to some of the residents that lacked it. And then as we've also seen more recently with the vaccine campaigns, just realizing that not everybody has internet access. And so as much as we're all fans of technology, sometimes we've got to do the old ways too. We've got to go door to door. We've got to make sure our seniors and our vulnerable citizens that don't have access to transportation, or frankly could have true food insecurity during this long extended period of time, that we also found new ways to deliver services to those folks and to make sure that we protected the most vulnerable people. And I guess the last point I would make is we found out our staff are really up to the challenges. We threw them into all kinds of new expectations and requirements, and they rose to the occasion. So that's a long-winded answer, Bob, but there's just so much I think we can be excited about.
No, I appreciate that very much. And kind of the intention is to be a bit long-winded here.
Okay.
We want you to share, what your experiences have been, and I think you both have come from unique and different perspectives. So, Unica, what are your thoughts on this question of how has the COVID pandemic changed the way government works, operates, and delivers services?
I think I'd probably speak a little bit more from the receiver of services, but I think that really initially, even from the professional side of things, it was a little harder for us to engage with some of our clients and people that we're used to meeting face to face. I think that things have smoothed out over the last year, and we've been able to get more comfortable with virtual meetings, which I think is huge. It's saved time, but also it's helped us to reach more people. Also, agencies are much more open to things like virtual presentations for shortlist and other forms of critical business communication. The other thing I've noticed is that as far as delivering documents or information, there's no hand carrying it. So kind of taking a step back and realizing, okay, maybe we plan things a little bit further in advance so that they're delivered in a timely manner, and also kind of keeping abreast of maybe the challenges with some of the shipping delays. I think is one thing to keep in mind as far as mail delays concerned. To speak also to, I guess, services. Another thing that Beth I think mentioned, I thought was an excellent point, was about how we need to kind of shift and really think about people who may not have access to certain things, such as internet. I've watched some school communities, excuse me, actually issue laptops and tablets for students so that they can get their work done as efficiently as they need to at home. I think also just from a personal side, I like the fact that, as you mentioned also, that the shift to some services has been accelerated as far as the use of internet. So things like booking appointments for the DMV, a lot of those things were, shifted to online and taken a little bit more seriously as far as, capacity. So those are some of the things that I noticed during the pandemic.
Thank you, Unica. Listening to what you both were talking about, and you both touched on the transition to virtual work, obviously, and that was one of the I guess topics that would be anticipated in this environment. But from my experience in talking to people, there was the initial concern with virtual, particularly as it comes to training, had to do with people didn't like the fact, or they were concerned that they wouldn't have the personal interaction that they were used to. And I was one of those people until I participated in a 4-day long training session with the Florida Association of Special Districts. And what we found was there were, I think, 16 16 or 19 people in the class. And everyone had their picture up just like we do right now. And it looked like, I guess they call it like the Brady Bunch type screen. And we were all able to look at each other and listen to each other. And the interesting thing is, I think we had a breakout session, broke them into groups for like 30 minutes. And then we spoke for about 30 minutes as a collective group. And then we did breakouts, and then we spoke. And I think just about every one of them after the program said that they had more interaction virtually than they would have if they were live, one-on-one, because it was set up so that they did have an opportunity to do a lot of discussions in those groups, and that they could see each other as opposed to looking at the back of somebody's head in a large room when you had tables broken out. So just a personal observation experience that I had with some of the changes in this one, have always been live, this type of training. But we tried it, and it was so successful that there's even some thoughts of just continuing it virtually. We are going to go to a live, but my point is that's a lesson that I think some have learned too that maybe hadn't used it before.
Well, let's go back to the virtual public meetings. We reached a whole new group of people who perhaps had small children, couldn't come down in person, lacked transportation, but had internet access. So being able to access public meetings and truly participate in them from a virtual way has opened a lot of eyes. So I think even as we go back to in-person council meetings, we're going to see a lot of communities say, but let's also figure out a way to make it possible to continue to have not just televised meetings, but also truly interactive opportunities for those who can't make it down to our public building to participate. So I think is one of the great lessons that we've had is some of the things we were forced to do out of necessity had these side benefits. And yeah, your point's well taken.
Yeah.
I also noticed that a lot of local governments quickly found somebody on their staff or some bodies on their staff who were adept at technology and could become Zoom masters or whatever the technology was that they were using, because you really had to learn the ins and outs of how do you do breakout rooms, how do you create these more interactive approaches and manage a process that requires, I think, a little bit of comfort level with the technology.
Good point. Unica, any other thoughts on this question or?
All great points, Beth. We have seen the same thing as far as the expectation for continued virtual when we go back to public meetings. But I don't have anything to add to this particular question.
Okay. Well, I don't see any questions from the attendees at this point.
I was going to say one more thing, Bob. I'm sorry. You know, when we're thinking about all the services we have with businesses and also with trying to get people to relocate, one of the new trends that we're seeing in some places is this digital nomad, where some places are trying to attract economic development by attracting expertise. You know, that is individuals who can work from anywhere, and why not, you know, work in Tampa or wherever the location might be.
Right.
So they're giving actual dollar incentives for people to relocate in some of these places where perhaps not as much of an issue in Florida, but you know, some places like Michigan and Maine that have lost residents to Florida have been trying to get these boomerang people who maybe once grew up in their states to come back and contribute their expertise locally.
Good point. It may have also helped drive home the important theory about being goal-oriented, assessing employees based on actual performance, what they do, as opposed to just showing up for work or being maybe connected in the internal politics of an organization. If they are it just sort of forces maybe a little more quantifying of the work that people do, and they're doing it remotely, and many of them perhaps are even more productive remotely than they would be if they were having to drive to an office, get in an office. For those who have office settings, and I do know that you still have to have, in many cases, the types of services still need that face-to-face, still need to be in the office. There's still that expectation for many residents, but there are certain positions that may transcend into, you know, as you say, we could get the very best, and they don't even have to live in our region alone, in our city or county.
Right. And, you know, we already see a lot of that with technology. Sometimes we've outsourced it, but instead of outsourcing everything to a company, we might be able to use this talent, what I would just call the digital nomads, to use some of the individuals who might, for one reason or another, need to live somewhere other than right in our community. And I guess that's the other point I would make. You touched on it, Bob. The notion that in government you always had to be there physically was so strong. And so there was a real aversion to telework. I think now there may be an openness to considering telework for some positions, not necessarily 5 days a week, but you know, it might be 1 day a week. And it might be just enough to be able to attract and retain the talent, because we're going to be bumping up against a lot of competition as we are able to rehire more of our needed staff and perhaps expand our staff.
Good point.
Yeah, Beth, I think you make a great point about the shift to remote work. I believe I read somewhere Global Workplace Analytics did some research, and they expect that 25 to 30% of U.S. employees are going to be working multiple days from home by the end of this year. So I think you're spot on.
Good. Well, tell you what, why don't we move to question number 2? Mike, if you want to change that slide. I'm going to pose this one to you first, Unica, and I'm reading it, the question, in the event we do have any attendee who had to dial in, didn't have a laptop available, but did want to participate, so they would know what question it was that we're addressing. So quickly, the question is, what resources have organizations relied upon most to navigate the shifts resulting from the COVID pandemic, i.e. new sources, technology, software, business, intergovernmental, and nonprofit relationships? Pretty broad question. Unica, your thoughts?
So I want to talk a little bit about, as far as new sources that we relied on. I believe that, you know, my team has done a good job of kind of really getting a plethora of sources, not kind of sticking to only one news channel or the other to get their information, but also making a lot of decisions, you know, based on CDC's guidance and information available from that standpoint. But I think the other thing, as far as technology, which really came through in our recent employee survey we did internally, closer to the start of the pandemic, we asked people what communication tools were they relying on most to be able to effectively communicate while working remotely. And so we learned that the Outlook, you know, email, 86% of our people relied on that. That was a huge necessity. But also WebEx and Teams were 70+% people really reported those were the most effective tools for them. And not to say, you know, least important, but cell phone calls. I think sometimes we take for granted, okay, we've got a laptop, we've got video, we can, you know, engage and see people, but sometimes a good old phone call is just what you need, especially in the age of, you know, new terms like Zoom fatigue, where people are completely exhausted of getting on video call after video call after video call. So that's some of the technology we really relied on during this particular period, but also got a chance to kind of talk with our IT manager, because as you all know, shifting from being an organization where IT is centralized and there are, you know, 40 offices, we went from having 40 offices to, you know, 850 offices, so to speak, of individuals that they are now responsible for serving. And so that was one of the biggest challenges they had to overcome, and they found a really great, you know, way to manage the ticketing program and making sure that people could put in requests. So that was a pretty smart, you know, shift for us. But the other thing that we also learned was something that was kind of a gift in this particular situation. Moffitt and Nichol began shifting to using laptops instead of desktop computers before the pandemic. And so when it was time for everybody to kind of pick up and go, we were able to easily shift, to a work from home environment because everybody could take their laptops. There wasn't, okay, let's, unpack the whole desktop and load it in the trunk for everybody to take it home. So that was a much smoother transition than we could have anticipated. And we think that was a huge advantage and one of the lessons learned. The other thing that was a really critical point for us in shifting to remote work was a VPN access, the virtual private network, so that everybody could have access to the information you would normally get when you're sitting inside of an office via our networks. And so having access and multiple layers of access for people, they actually shifted from having just East Coast and West Coast to having more localized office VPN set up so that we could have a speedier connection for everybody. And I thought that was a really smart sort of shift in terms of the technology that we're relying on to be effective.
Thank you, Unica. Beth?
I think that some of the things Unica was just talking about in terms of laptops for everybody, VPN connections, that wasn't always set up, especially in some of our smaller local governments. So I know some places, especially smaller jurisdictions, were really scrambling to try to get everybody a laptop and get them properly set up with a VPN. So it was a hustle time back there for a lot of places. The other resource that I think some places have started paying more attention to is centralized procurement. And that might be in the past where you would have some decentralized procurement in your departments, for instance. But that became rather inefficient with the PPE needs and how to keep track of them, how to have a proper inventory, how to make sure they met quality standards. So that's one of what I would call the after action lessons, is having a centralized approach to ordering essential supplies makes a lot of sense, and having that proper inventory control. The other thing I'd just say, and maybe this is technology related, maybe not, but you mentioned in your question the nonprofit relationships. One place, we talked before about the fact that we need to rely on our staff to do different things sometimes, and that was particularly true in this pandemic. I was struck by the food insecurity issue and how Surprise, Arizona handled that. They realized they had a health and human services employee who had all the network established, and email connections and all the rest of it with the faith community, with the nonprofits. So when suddenly the school lunch program stopped and the Meals on Wheels became a problem, they were able to make him part of the incident command operation to deal with this food insecurity challenge. And within 24 hours, they were able to get 20,000 meals out to people in need. So it just reminds us of the great talent we have, and whether it's redeploying our library personnel to help with whatever it might be, contact tracing, advising small businesses on how they could apply for some of the PPP loans, because we sometimes forget how challenged our small businesses are in navigating all of these opportunities that are out there. And we have a terrific staff who can help them, especially since we could keep our libraries open for a period of time. And these wonderful librarians had the wherewithal to really help the small businesses navigate these challenges.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Before I have you, Unica or Beth, further comment on the question, we actually have a comment that's come in from one of our attendees, Alan Rosen. I'm going to read it. Appreciate that, Alan. It's a perspective he has, and perhaps we can discuss it briefly. One of the downsides I see to moving to digital nomads on a large scale is that most of our communities actually contribute to the local economy. In some places, one of the largest employers is the government. If we lose all of those residents to other places, we will lose that economic impact as well. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's everything in balance. So the point about the digital nomads is just to note that they are out there. And if you're having trouble hiring people within your community, you know, there are some options you might have that don't occur to you. But I think we all want, that's why some places are putting incentives out there, because they've lost population. And they want exactly what he was talking about. They want the people to be there in their communities. So it's just one economic development strategy for those communities that have lost population and are challenged by getting expertise within their communities.
Unica, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective of how it can be a source of economic loss for some communities. I think maybe there's a way to design the program or the incentives that you might create locally to kind of cushion that process if people are coming to your community as digital nomads. Maybe it's okay, you know, you have to have this level of community involvement or contributions locally to whatever initiatives are in place for economic impact. I think it's kind of a sad thing, but I think Beth pointed out in other ways it's an incentive to solve the problem if you are low on people, and it also helps you win the talent war. I think that's the other thing that sometimes we think about, well, why did we make the shift? It's not always just, I guess, a matter of economics from the standpoint of this place is cheaper to live, but if you can find the best of the best, and that might make your government run more smoothly, I think that's a huge plus.
Yeah, I think it also has a flip side. If you focus your community on quality of life, you're going to get a lot of those nomads wanting to live in your jurisdiction.
That's right.
They may be working for a jurisdiction
Definitely.
outside, but they're going to want to be where you are. So quality of life may become even more important, and it always has been important in terms of economic development.
Right.
I think sometimes we get a false sense of understanding economic development as being business development, creating jobs. Those are important in other types of development, but quality of life is what incentivizes a lot of that to happen. Property values go up. And in this particular case, maybe again, if the focus is more on quality of life, those nomads are going to want to live in your jurisdiction and want to shop and dine in the restaurants in your jurisdiction. So probably a balance. I think your point about that, Beth, I think is very well taken about, you know, being a balance. But it certainly is something to be aware of, and I appreciate the comment from Alan, because it is something that, in going forward and doing your strategic planning, it's something to keep in mind.
And it's a good reminder of the value of the quality of life issues, having great parks, having, you know, places where people can safely walk and have outdoor recreation, ride their bicycles. I mean, all of these factors attract people along with good schools.
Those are huge factors of deciding where to live. In fact, I mean, the reason I moved to Florida last year is quality of life.
Well, you have a lot of people who are following you, if I believe what I hear on the news. Anyways, why don't we, unless there's anything else on this second question, and then we can also come back to some of these questions. Why don't we move on to the third question, Mike? And Beth, I'm going to ask you to take this one first again. The question is, it's easy to notice the stresses and troubles that COVID has triggered. What are some good things that have resulted from this experience? And I know we talked a little bit about some of that already.
Yeah.
But if you could elaborate a little more, Beth, on what are some of the good things that have resulted from the experience that we've all gone through?
Well, I do think it's brought us closer together in some ways, which may seem counterintuitive since we haven't been able to see each other. But just the awareness of all the individuals who've been struggling, especially, you know, people who've been trying to keep their small businesses and restaurants functioning. I've been very impressed with the innovations that I've seen out there. It just seemed like it was almost organic, where local governments would change their zoning practices to allow streets to be closed so restaurants could operate more outdoors where people felt safer. Marketing. some of these small businesses and restaurants included, they didn't have any real experience with marketing sometimes, especially not virtually. So I think the fact that many cities and counties would actually work with them to say, here's some ways you can use social media to get the word out. And then they would even go so far as to set up, you probably have seen some of these in your communities where there'd be perhaps an incentive program that, you can get this kind of benefit if you order takeout or, buy your holiday gifts at these local places, because so many people were ordering, and I did too, we all use Amazon, sure, but I think we really care about our small businesses surviving because we want vibrant towns and cities and counties. So to the extent we could find ways to market that, oh, these places are still operating, here's how you can purchase from them, here's how you get to their website, and you can just, we had some in our area that would even deliver, so I took advantage of a local toy store, for instance, because it would deliver. And that was an advantage to me because I didn't really want to go inside stores when COVID was raging. And I really appreciated the fact that these little establishments would have somebody from their operation show up with something that was needed. So I think the fact that local governments took the initiative, checked in with their small businesses, often discovered that they were having supply chain issues. I mean, one of the things I focus on is disaster recovery issues, and that means you got to be prepared. Most small businesses don't have a continuity of operation plan. They don't even know what the supplies are that where they come from, what they would do if that got interrupted. So I think we in local government have this leadership role that we can play to make our entire community more resilient, the individuals, the small businesses, the whole 9 yards. And that to me is one of the ongoing lessons. And as I'm reviewing kind of my own after action thinking following this pandemic, it's not over, I know, but we're at least, I think, seeing improvements. But it's recognizing our leadership responsibility in government.
Thank you, Beth. Unica.
Oh, well, I'm going to start with maybe a sort of personal story. For me, I think that one of the biggest reliefs is trying to figure out the work-life balance. Being remote has allowed me to be able to pick up in my office, following an unexpected medical emergency for my mother. So that was a huge plus. I think just in general, I think one of the funniest things we found when we did our internal survey was that people were, yes, they were excited that, we were home and safe, as far as COVID was concerned, but they also really liked the fact that there was no more commute. And so that's probably a personal favorite of mine as well. It's, not, doing the whole hop in the car, tailpipe warrior sort of, staring down the road to get into the office. And so that has given me back a little bit of my time to get up in the morning and, do a workout or something before I start my day. So for me, it's been a huge plus in terms of work-life balance. I think that's one of the best things. More than 70% of our people have said, they've got, same or less stress working from home. I mean, so I feel like a less stressed group of people is a more productive group of people. So it's, not just me. And I think that sometimes people have this idea of, okay, well, everyone's stressed out because they're working from home. It's like, well, it's going well for some people, actually. We even found that, more than half of our employees said that, the school schedule for the kids didn't impact their work schedule. They really liked having, flexibility and felt like they could produce more work. And I feel the same way personally. So I like the shift because it allows me to kind of take control of my day in a different kind of way, because not being in the office means, okay, we're scheduling events or I'm getting a call and I can respond to it. No one's kind of popping in and going, hey, and I miss those candid conversations sometimes, but I also appreciate the productivity that being remote has allowed me.
A couple other things I wanted to mention in terms of the innovations. I think the technology and data that we now have at our fingertips has helped us improve our communication with residents. And I've been really impressed with some of the dashboards that cities and counties have put up. I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, and they have a really good dashboard. And one of the things I appreciate about it, because it's really frustrating not being able to get scheduled for a vaccine for a long time. But they are really good about, getting the word out about, here's how many doses we've gotten, here's our priority, here are the other places where you might be able to get a vaccine appointment. And then just also showing us progress all the time, because I think that's one of the things that we can do well in government is sharing that we're making progress. We may not be where we want to be, but when people see that we're moving forward, it makes them feel good. And I think it also has just been important when there's been a short supply. In this case, it was the vaccines for a while. Now it's gasoline. Let's hope that gets resolved soon. But yes. I think anytime you have scarcity and people are anxious, in this case, terribly anxious. I don't know how they did it, but and maybe a number of places in Florida did it too, but the city and county of Broomfield, Colorado, before the pandemic was declared, started putting out weekly communications to residents in February. So they saw this coming better than I did. I was in Florida having a really nice time in February 2020, not thinking about what was coming. And here was the city and county of Broomfield, Colorado, doing initially this weekly update to all residents. And then they switched to daily, when it became hot. So I think our ability to shift gears and get the information out to people in a variety of ways has really been impressive. Some communities that have a television station at their disposal were having weekly or sometimes daily briefing with their elected officials in front of the camera, which we know is always a place that elected officials enjoy being if they're well staffed. And I think, again, whether it's using the phone to reach people with important information, because again, not everybody has the internet. So sending out messages via a telephone broadcast system is another technique that I saw a number of places using. And I guess the last innovation area, or perhaps wake-up call, was childcare. Our essential workers couldn't get into their jobs without childcare when the schools shut down and the daycare centers shut down. So we saw a lot of quick thinking local governments looking for ways to sometimes work with the private sector, nonprofit sector, to get something set up so their essential workers could function. And that was the case in Mankato, Minnesota, where they partnered with the YMCA so that they have a lot of health workers there as well. So health workers, public safety workers, both had access to this learning pod, a couple of them that they set up at the Y. And then they could provide them with a grant from their CARES money. So that's the other thing. There's been a lot of innovative use of the federal dollars that we've been getting.
Thanks, Beth. Unica, we have a question that's come in. Very good question. Melinda Husser, or I think it's Husser. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but Melinda has a question and I'm going to read it. What are your thoughts on data security risks with working from home? For example, how the Wi-Fi networks and employees work off of and at home system may be posing a risk to the security of an organization's data. Organizations typically have firewalls in their office to monitor network traffic and block malicious activity. Many people do not have a firewall to guard their home network. Thoughts?
Well, some of the things that I've witnessed here at Moffitt and Nichol that we've kind of gone the extra mile is first off doing more training to make sure that people understand the cybersecurity risk and understanding things as something as simple as phishing. Also, we've got upcoming training regarding the understanding that some of the threats that we face from cybersecurity are internal, and making sure that we engage in the kind of behavior that's necessary to protect us from those kinds of threats. One of the things they asked us all to do basically the moment we all went home was to download Authenticator app on our cell phones. And so that is another sort of security measure to make sure that when we log in, we, yes, that we are using secure connections that way. So there's a lot of steps in place to protect us and guard us, and regular sort of network scans to make sure that everything is in good order and we have not been compromised. Our team has done an amazing job whenever anything has ever happened, like maybe the once I've been here and saying, hey, don't open this email, like, and making sure that it doesn't get any further than the one person who reported it, sort of thing. So I think that, yeah, it's definitely a risk, but I think that you have to kind of take the good with the bad and balance, okay, the needs of making sure that the data is safe and everyone's health and safety in this particular instance. But I think moving forward, we're going to see, you know, a shift in the movement of people back in the offices, probably in part because of the concern that you've raised about making sure that everything is very secure.
Beth, thoughts?
I think those are really great points, and I would just add that the training can be helpful because, as Unica just pointed out, a lot of times it's human error that gets us into trouble. And at ICMA, they send us fake fishes periodically, and if we fail any fish test, then we have to do a 30-minute refresh course. So it's a big incentive to check. And I will admit publicly that I did fail one because I clicked on an HR message, because we have different people working in HR. There were a lot of turnover, and so it looked like something I needed to read until it wasn't, and so I had to do my 30-minute refresher training.
One of the things that I think keep in mind too, that before COVID, a number of people were working from home already. Right. In many cases. But one of the common denominators in those that I think have been most prepared is a current and a current policy that's one of those livable, breathable documents that is changeable and stays current. But you have to have a policy. It's just like when whether you have investments you have to be responsible for, or some internal controls with money that you typically have. It's important to have a policy. And that's the policy that, as you were talking about, Beth, that you do the training from. But it is important to have policy, not just say, okay, seems like a swell idea, let's work from home. The reality is, you know, sometimes, a lot of times, local government has to react to situations that don't enable the employees or those responsible to cover everything. So I think it would be a delusion to think that even a policy is going to cover everything, but I think it certainly is a great point. One of the comments here from someone was, we use VPNs and firewalls within those private networks. So just having some plan in place, recognition, stay in contact with your peers and for best practices, and kind of do the best that you can. I did notice that we talked about those things that are good. One of you mentioned about the reduction in having to not have to commute the traffic. And I think I read somewhere about the greenhouse gases and being reduced, and how cities that look foggy from 30,000 feet were actually clear in many cases because of the reduction in some of the traffic, intercity traffic. So I guess there's some positives along those lines. But I guess the one other point that I'd mention is, whenever there's a situation like this, it's a great opportunity to show leadership. When times are, when things are comfortable and everything is just going to as anticipated, it's really difficult to be a leader in those cases, or some would argue it is. I think you can be a leader in any situation, but particularly when you're challenged, that's when you find out who can handle the stresses and who already has a team in place, who's already built that trust. And that's a lot of the important attributes of someone being in local government management, is to have that trust built and those policies in place and those relationships built before the incident occurs. It makes it a whole lot easier to try to overcome it. We have one more question. Why don't we go ahead and go to that question, Mike, and make sure we get it in before the end of the day. And again, thanks for those questions that have come in so far. We very much appreciate that. This is our fourth question, our final question for today that I'm posing to the panelists. That's a predetermined question. And it reads as follows. What does a model workplace, if one exists, look like post-pandemic? And what are some best practices that local governments should consider in planning for the future? Unica, I'll start with you.
Okay, well, one of the things I've learned is, we expect 30% of people to be, working from home by the end of the year. So for me, when I think about a model workplace, think about a place that's really ultimately designed to suit the needs of the workers in a way that empowers them to increase innovation and improve outcomes while keeping everybody safe. And so obviously, I think that we're going to come back to a workplace culture that places a bigger emphasis on cleaning. But also, I think that there's consideration for some organizations to take a hotel sort of approach to the way that they seat their employees instead of assigned seating. So hoteling is kind of the idea of, okay, we've got, for example, 12 workstations. If you're coming in today, make sure that you've registered for your time slot to use this particular station. So that is something that I've seen as I've talked to some of my industry peers is a common conversation about how to lay out physical space. There's consideration of remodeling places so that there are group lounges with desks and chairs and sort of couches versus traditional office space with, say, maybe a more formal lunch room and traditional office spaces. So I think that really it's going to probably be a hybrid, and it's going to be very, very much based on what the organization does and what the people in those offices do. I know Beth mentioned earlier about how remote work may vary, not just necessarily due to people's organization they belong to, but also because of the role they play. So it's probably much easier for me, for example, to manage a proposal remotely than it is perhaps for a team to have a collaborative conversation about the best approach for stream restoration. So that's where you have to think about what works best for your people to get the job done, to serve the end game.
Okay, thank you, Beth.
Well, when I think about the workplace, I start with the people. And so I think the points Unica made about being aware of where people are and where the future workforce is going in terms of their needs and preferences. So what does that look like? I think we will in government also be feeling the pressure to offer more telework and not just in an emergency. I think flexible benefits may be also part of the mix. And when I say that, I don't have a particular recommendation in mind, but just younger employees, for instance, are looking for things like paternity leave, not just maternity leave. So being open to what the needs are of your emerging workforce, I think will help us in attracting and retaining the quality people that we want and need. I think we're just going to be moving a lot more into artificial intelligence, virtual services. I think we have to keep ourselves learning and be supportive of professional development and learning in our organizations, because whether it's being prepared for the next disaster or just being prepared for the change ahead, you never know what technology around the corner is going to be ideally suited to solve a nagging problem. And so it's, to me, we're at a really exciting point because we have this infusion of federal dollars to help us think about some of our long-term needs to both improve our own workplace and also the community, because as we talked about before, our employees, we want them to live in our communities. And so when our communities are great places and have, the broadband and all the parks and services, and and looking ahead to adapting our communities for the changing climate. I think that all these things will help our future workplace function really well. I mean, we certainly will not have, in the north, we won't have snow days anymore because we have our laptops. I don't know, I guess we'll have the same kind of thing in Florida with the hurricane watches. You just take your laptop home and you keep going, right? So I think the modern workplace is going to be a learning organization that is attentive to its employees. And I think the points are well taken about creating an environment where collaboration is the norm. And it might be, just as simple as having some cross-department teams that function on an ongoing basis so that they build networks and thinking to guide the organization.
Yeah, I think both Unica, you and Beth focus at least in part on what your workplace looks like, what your workforce looks like, what are their needs and what are the needs of your organization. Sort of reminded me of, and I don't know the exact quote, but it has something about the future when we were talking about the future workplace. Something along the lines that it's the future worker, successful organization is not necessarily going to be focusing its workers on those who can read and write, but those who can adapt and learn. Because even though they may be an expert in a particular area, things change so rapidly. They need to be able to adapt. I think it was Darwin, it says, not the smartest or the strongest of the species, it's the most adaptable species. Thus the reason the cockroach lived through the Ice Age, very adaptable. So similarly, I think in the future, we're looking at that as well. One follow-up question, I'm going to double check to make sure we didn't have something here that's come in. But one follow-up question, it seems to be that at least if you spend any of your time following the cable news networks, everything seems to be hyper politicized today, no matter what it is. Every word, every policy, particularly at the state and federal level, but it's transcended down to the local level. And when we look at what our organizations need and what the employees, what their expertise are, maybe what their interests are, et cetera, I think one of the variables that's very important is our elected officials, that the city and county managers need to work with. Some of them come from different perspectives, obviously, and different ideas on what the organization should look like. And maybe in the purest form of council manager forms of government, academically, you may think that is, they wouldn't have much influence on a day-to-day basis, or should. The reality is they do, and the manager needs to establish that relationship. So any thoughts about how important that variable is in terms of going forward in the future, in terms of working with those elected officials again, who maybe come from different political perspectives and ideologies and their own personal experiences when it comes to virtual working and things like that. Any thoughts on that, either one of you?
Well, that is got to be the national conversation that we need to have, right, Bob? It's getting in the way of us making good long-term decisions. One of the things I've observed is we're paying more attention to, I guess, what they're calling trusted messengers. And when we see vaccine hesitancy, this is a good example where the only way that we're going to get to some groups that have been hesitant is if the person who's talking to them about the importance and value of getting vaccinated is credible with that community. So it's not going to do any good if I'm talking to a particular group that doesn't relate to me. It needs to be, someone from that group who has credibility. I was talking to Andrea Arnold today from Decatur, Georgia, and she was telling me that she's concerned that they only have 40% of their firefighters vaccinated. They have an African American medical doctor who is their advisor, and she said he is extremely effective in communicating, and she is hopeful that he will be able to have those conversations with the firefighters that she's not able to have. They're mostly men. I don't know what the demographics are beyond that, but it's a group that, for whatever reason, they're first responders. They're high contact. So you really want to see these people getting vaccinated, but I think nationwide, it is a group that has been more hesitant. So it's a challenge. And so that's one thought I have. And the other is, just to do everything we can as managers to try to build consensus, bring the elected officials together around goal setting, finding things that they can agree upon locally. And I believe me, I know this is no small chore. It's really the toughest work out there, but it's the most important work.
Thanks, Beth. Unica, your thoughts?
Yeah, to kind of piggyback off of your statement about making sure that you have the right person in place to influence the decision making of the people around. I think that elected officials are going to have to connect, like you said, with the experts, the people who have trusted, expertise in the particular communities to be able to drive the results that they're seeking. I think that also means making sure that you've gotten a group of advisors that surround you to tell you where the audiences are. So for example, if you're trying to reach a particular demographic and they're never on Facebook, like you don't want to create messaging there for them. So you have to make sure that you develop messaging in a place that makes sense for everybody. So for example, I was watching a documentary recently that talked about AI and the importance of how social media factors into the data they aggregate, but also how even individuals, as Beth kind of touched on, can be a powerful impact and influence. Maybe it's not the doctor who happens to also be African American that reaches people, but maybe it's also, my two best friends have gotten the vaccine already, for example. And so maybe that's a way to influence people to do it. And so they posted on Facebook, hey, I've got mine. And so you kind of get this influence from community behavior that also is a huge element I think that elected officials could begin to leverage as well if they use the tools effectively.
Thank you both. We have one other comment, and we've got just about 2 minutes, and it's from an old friend, Doug Dryman. Doug, and I'm going to read the question, but I think it actually appears to be rhetorical. I'm not sure that was your intent, but I'm going to read it. How accepting will the general public be of public employees having lounges and, quote, relaxing, unquote, office spaces to work in, as it is more increasingly being found in the private industry? How can local governments address this concern?
We're laughing.
15-minute responses, Beth, Unica? 15-second responses.
I don't think that's going to be received.
What's that?
I do think appearances count, and so however we make inviting places for our teams to interact, we need to do so with the eye that the local reporter coming into that space will feel like it is a professional space. So it probably, I think that kind of speaks for governments being a little bit different from the private sector, but we can still have inviting, comfortable places. Just, check it out with your friendly reporter first.
Unica, any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm just a little tickled at the statement. I'm imagining people coming in and is going, hey, I'm asking questions for, the Tribune, and they're kind of lounging on the sofa. I do understand that may not be the best appearance, and as Beth has suggested, it's more about making spaces and inviting, not necessarily, setting up the local bar in the office.
Definitely not the local bar.
Well, thank you both. I think, our time is really up, unfortunately. But I want to thank Elizabeth Keller and Unica Walcott for taking your time and not only preparing for today, because a lot of people aren't familiar. When we get ready to do these webinars, there is some preparation involved, at least one or more sessions, and of course they need to do their self-preparations. So we appreciate you taking the time to do that for FCCMA today. Also want to acknowledge the FCCMA board. They continue to provide this type of training. They've been doing it now for, golly, 12 years, providing these webinars. And our webinars are archived on the Center for Florida Local Government Excellence website. So you can access them on demand at any time, the list of webinars that have been provided. So thank you all very much for your participation. And Lori, I see you just have a comment in here. I'm going to quickly read, make sure we don't leave anyone out. We built a Zen zone in our new City Hall for employees. Solid doors, proxy access only. They deserve a quiet space to relax on breaks. I like that.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, good idea. It's like, yeah, and that's not accessible.
Well,
But anyways, and when you build a new City Hall, I mean, it's maybe a little easier to incorporate something like that. I remember being participating in a session on mindfulness where, you know, and Lori was actually, what reminded me, she was the one that brought, I think, Trainovations in to do that. And it was about individually how you can relax with proper breathing exercises. Make sure you take some time during the day to do that and just put yourself at ease, and it makes you a lot more productive the rest of the day. So anyways, thank you for that, Lori. And I thank everyone, and attendees particularly, thank you for participating. It obviously creates the value that's needed for us to continue to do this. So thank you all for your participation, and there will be a brief evaluation that's going to pop up. I hope you take a few seconds and complete that. Thank you all again. With that, we're now adjourned.
thank you.
Thank you.